Hi, my name's Gabi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the volunteer and community manager at EarthCorps. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Dre.
Hi, my name is Dre Say. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. Gabby and I know each other from working together at Washington Conservation Action in the other Washington State.
Awesome. So where are you joining us from?
Yeah, Seattle, Washington. The closest river to me is the Duwamish River, which is named after the indigenous people here, most of whom are in the Muckleshoot tribe.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So I guess I'll just jump into the connection that we have into leading our union at Washington Conservation Action. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about leading that and your past in racial justice.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I'll try to be succinct. I joined that organization in 2020, before the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is a small environmental nonprofit that does both political advocacy kind of work and then also like voting, electoral work as well. And I joined there as an organizer to connect with people and community regarding environmental issues and environmental candidates. So in that context, me as someone who has like a mixed background, I'm Chinese, Filipino, and white, and also me as someone who had seen the really bad conditions, frankly, for people of color in different nonprofits, in particular for Black women. I wanted to be more proactive about both my own job protection, my own rights as a worker in the United States, is the context, but also to be really in solidarity and be coordinated and connected with especially other people of color workers, but also workers across our organization, across race. So a group of us founded, initially it was just an external conversation outside of work. It was like 5 people of color and 2 white people, and we got together and said, we want the racial justice conditions of this workplace to change. And when I say that, I actually am not just talking about the things that we talk about race, but also, salary transparency and increased salaries is race, right? Is a racial justice issue. Job protection is a racial justice issue. Being able to speak up without fear of retaliation is also a racial justice issue. So that group then later became our staff union, and we won our first contract with the organization a few months ago. So that's some of the background on that.
Awesome. So could you tell me a little bit about like the successes and failures of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think successes is especially like raising the base wage from when I started to the contract is like 12,000 US dollars, which is a lot of money. I also think, like I said, job protection is a big deal because in the US, basically all workers are at will, which means that they can fire you for whatever reason. They don't really have to give a reason. And there's stuff around immigrant justice that I'm proud of when it comes to like protecting workers who are not US citizens. I think that's super important and reflects both some of the staff and also like our shared values. I think the the lack of success I think when we are organizing in a nonprofit context, by its very nature, you're going to get some people who are more like upper class or upper middle class, or share those values. Like they see themselves as future CEOs or future managers, and so they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to stand up for fellow workers, or they feel like very risk averse when it comes to taking coordinated action regarding racial justice as workers. So I think that's one kind of internal union issue when it comes to just the difficulties in taking more strong action as a union. And I think something that's happening across the United States right now in environmental unions, whether it be well, you can follow. There's a green union town halls and stuff like that coming up. You can look that up on Instagram if you're interested. But there is a coordinated campaign across the environmental nonprofit union sector by the bosses to be anti-union. And there's illegal charges and stuff like that being filed. And there's also things that may not cross that legal line, but are clearly meant to crush this worker organizing and keep things with the status quo, where CEOs are making, at some of these places, making millions of dollars while workers are not being paid a living wage or being retaliated for speaking up for racial justice.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap between the actions of union busting and then also the actions of racist actions. So as you know, the dismantling white supremacy is an ongoing process and can feel performative for organizations and businesses. And so where do you see groups tend to stop the work when they feel that they've accomplished enough, and how and why can they push further into that anti-racist stance?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, this idea of stopping when you feel like you've achieved. I think the only time I've really truly seen that is when people in upper management are in particular white people, but again, I think that there are people of color in management who do this as well. When it goes beyond just like reading a book privately or reading or doing like a anti-racist book club, which is not to say that we don't need to educate ourselves and we need to read. But when it goes beyond the step of like book club and it goes into, okay, let's take the things that we've talked about and learned from one another or from this book and actually implement them to change the fundamental power structures of this organization, fundamentally change the power structures of these institutions we're working with, or, advocating for those things at a wider scale as part of our institution's work. That's when people in upper management are like, let's stop. So I don't see it actually happening that much in my personal experience with workers, again, across race. And when I have seen that happen in really limited instances, I've been able to build up accountable relationships either with those people directly or with some of my white colleagues who really care, who are really out here doing the work. And I say, hey, did you notice so-and-so, was saying something or doing something? Can you please talk to them and just bring them into this work, bring them into this union work, bring them into this racial justice work, and ask them to recommit in a meaningful way. So I actually don't see this idea. I've never really truly seen a large group of workers say, oh, we've achieved it, we've done it, we don't need to do any more racial justice work. I see that coming from a place of management, when management's afraid that their power is being threatened. And let me be clear, their power is being threatened through our racial justice work. Unless you're one of the tiny few institutions that really is truly equitable, The reality is, like, doing this racial justice work needs to have an intersection with the international labor movement. That combination combined with our meaningful anti-capitalist environmental work that does threaten these like fundamental power structures of nonprofits. So like in the United States, I don't know as much about other contexts, but in the United States, there's a close tie between, you know, our what we call the nonprofit industrial complex, and like these major donor foundations, which you know, are used, which are used by people who are essentially like hoarding wealth, right? So there's a lot of fear internally about alienating major donors on one hand, and on the other hand, I think sometimes people in management use that as a way to deflect and delay meaningful conversations and progress on racial justice.
Yeah, definitely. It's like it is reinforcing the system rather than doing what nonprofits are made to do, is trying to solve a problem and provide for communities and give back, because they want to just exist throughout eternity, as opposed to really tackling why they were, what their mission is. So do you have any recommendations for individuals to either push their organizations or push themselves? You said that there has been a lot of work from workers, but how to sort of raise that upward in the power structure to begin to confront the racism in their organization or in their community?
Yeah, I have a couple kind of more like theoretical things and more concrete things. I think in terms of political education, the Indigenous Environmental Alliance or Network, in which is based like in the United States, they released a really good guide on carbon pricing and the ways in which carbon pricing is a false solution, that I've really relied on. And then another thing, just like more generally, is making connections between these kind of like more, well, how do I say? Making connections between us, whatever work you're doing in your institution, and like the broader environmental movement and climate movement with workers. So for instance, like, are we making those connections between our work and the farm workers? You know, what's the local farm worker? Is there a union? You know, are they organized in a formal institution? What are the working conditions of people who are on the front lines of climate change? You know, or even in the United States, this is a serious issue. I don't know internationally. People who are incarcerated, who are firefighters, right, and being paid hardly anything to do really important but also like serious work, where they're not even being compensated anything close to fairly for you know, in some cases like potentially putting their life on the line. So making those connections, seeing ourselves as workers and making those connections across the environmental justice movement, I think is important. And then more concretely, all of the racial justice gains that I've seen in the workplace have come from a foundation of workers talking to one another without the boss around. It is really difficult to move past some of these blocks if you're not having those conversations amongst one another. You know, that earlier example I talked about in my nonprofit that I was a part of, we, you know, we were all so dedicated to this nonprofit that we did it in our free time. It was such a crisis for us, and we cared so much that we did it in our free time. But you know, for some people, that's not going to be the case. So I think just having those conversations with one another, even if it's just one-on-one, I think if you're looking around at your organization, you don't have a union, you're not particularly organized, and you don't know where to start, I think having conversations with people that you trust, or just bringing up an issue that would allow you to better understand where they're coming from. For instance, a lot of our first conversations that we had were not, necessarily about really important issues like Black Lives Matter, but actually about our salary and salary transparency and the ways in which women were not being paid equitably, and the ways in which women, I think in particular in the US, but really around the world, there's this kind of way in which women are if you ask for a raise, that's too much, that's too aggressive. But when men do it, it's fine. So our first conversations were actually about sexism, basically, and salary transparency, because we have a lot of white women in the workplace, and that was our jumping off point. Just so many racial justice issues related to the Black Lives Matter movement, related to us listening to indigenous anti-capitalists who are saying carbon pricing is a false solution, which is directly related to the work we were doing. And for people who are doing work out in the field, I mean, I'm sure you all have heard this before, but like, whose land are you on? Who's do they have, is there a local tribe that has sovereignty over that land, like as a reservation? Like there's a reservation system in the United States, and I know in other places, or is there a different kind of sovereignty or ownership or battle over the land itself, led by indigenous people? And what is that political terrain look like? And frankly, understanding that a lot of times our institutions are not really going to be truly in solidarity. And so not wanting to make false promises to others and say, oh, I know that we'll be there for you. Really understanding ourselves in the internal political terrain so that we don't make false promises to people, or we don't have personal relationships with someone, maybe, right, where it is racially equitable, and then we turn around and it's like, oh, my institution is not backing me up, and there isn't that like longevity of like organizational to organizational, or organizational to tribe or nation relationships that really enable long-term political building.
Yeah. I have always appreciated the way that you intersect all of these like very complicated topics in like a very clear way. And also the way that you focus so much on the relationship, because that is the foundation, and that is like it's the people, like when the people will be happy, the environment will be happy. And so I appreciate the connection building from your perspective. But I think we are out of time. Did you have any last minute things that you wanted to plug, or like resources that you wanted to share, or anything like that?
I mean, I was excited to learn this was international. There's so many amazing things like around the world that are going on right now. I think the most pessimistic people who do the least, frankly, that I've personally met are Americans who do not understand what is happening outside this country. There are amazing things happening, in Panama, in Bolivia, in Ecuador. I that's where my heart is close to, that and those movements in the Philippines. But also I know like all over the world, there's outside the Americas, there's amazing things happening. And I'm really glad that you all are doing this work. And I hope that when you're making these international connections, we're calling out this neocolonialism and imperialism, and there's an understanding that hovering all over all of our heads, whether or not you're from the United States, is that the US military is the world's #1 polluter. So we can't forget that. We can't be silent about that. And I hope that we're all bringing that intersection of the ways in which imperialism is affecting our work, even in these like small nonprofits, or in ways in which we may not always see those intersections. It's always there. So that would be my last thought to everyone.
Awesome. Sweet. Thank you so much.